Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I have a star-studded panel today with us. What a year for the world. I hope everyone is doing well, celebrating with your families and loved ones. And for all our audience who are tuning in live from all over the world, I want to, first of all, on behalf of our entire team, wish you a very happy new year. And I want to, first of all, congratulate Sid for the exceptional appointment by Secretary General Guterres of the United Nations to be the incoming resident coordinator to China. You're going to land in China in January, just ahead of the Chinese New Year, at possibly one of the most amazing period of global shifts and changes. And I also want to congratulate Professor Kerry Brown for your 20th book. I just came to understand. You've written 20 books in the past 10 years, and the last one, or I should say the 20th one, is The History of Modern China. So check it out. And also, Michael Kugelman. Michael, you have been so much in the news in 2020. Everywhere I turn around, I read CNN and what have you, and I see your name right there, and I learned something about Asia from you. And I should say, at the Wilson Center, where you lead the Asia program initiatives there, in 2019, you welcomed the Vice President Mike Pence to deliver a pivotal speech on China, and I think that's, in a way, started to help shape the U.S. renewed understanding about its relationship with China. And I want to say, Aaron, we have had quite an active year at Wikistrat, and in Washington, D.C., we do game theories, right? That's what we do as policymakers and think tankers. And over the summer, we did this simulated game theory between U.S. and the Chinese government. And over the summer, I think it was July or August-ish, we talked about simulated scenarios of a possible President Trump's visit to Taiwan. We talked about a possible China-U.S., or I should say Washington, D.C.'s blanket sanction of Chinese technology companies. And so all of these scenarios back in July, August, I thought that was quite advanced. And so I think either you know the current government well, or maybe the current government knows you well. So I'd like to talk about some of these outcomes. And I want to welcome Mario. It's been an amazing year for you as well. I'm sure that one single article that you wrote, I think just ahead of your bedtime, right, in February, that's hit over 1 million views, and that's taken your story entirely to a global level.
Right. 2 million.
So,
yeah, that's crazy. Yeah.
amazing time for all of you, I'm sure. So let me formally welcome our distinguished guests today. Siddharth Chatterjee, the incoming UN resident coordinator to China. Professor Kerry Brown, director of the Lau China Institute at King's College London. Michael Kugelman, deputy director of the Asia program at Wilson Center. Aaron Kessler, CEO of Wikistrat, a Washington, D.C.-based strategic consultancy and think tank, and Mario Cavolo, senior fellow at China's, I think, leading think tank today, China Goes Global. And so, gentlemen, I'd like to start with a little bit reflection of China in 2020 before we head over to 2021. So could we please single out one event that really, you think, defines or will redefine China's future? Can we start with you, please, Sid? Can we please start with you?
I was just trying to find the mic button. My apologies. So, I think the primacy of universal health coverage has suddenly come right into the center of the global kaleidoscope. In fact, it reminds me of the Greek philosopher Herophilus when he said that when health is absent, wisdom cannot reveal itself, art cannot manifest, strength cannot fight, wealth becomes useless, and intelligence cannot be applied. And to me, Now is the time for the decade of action for the Sustainable Development Goals. We merely have about 10 years to achieve it. And the universal health coverage and the importance of health has virtually become the central pillar around which the success of the remaining Sustainable Development Goals will be. And therefore, the primacy of Herophilus' statement now rings even more true than it did during 325 BC when he said it. Over to you.
When we went back to 350 BC, Kerry, what do you think? You recently wrote a book about contemporary China. What is that defining moment, you think, in 2020?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the obvious thing to say would be that moment in Wuhan when local officials realized they had a problem but didn't know quite what, and then acted in ways which have obviously attracted a lot of criticism since. But I mean, that was really a key moment, even though it was not clear whether that was at the end of 2019 or at the very beginning of 2020. Anyway, I think, though, for me, the moment when China posted positive growth after, the kind of first quarter is quite significant, because I think it sort of shows that the geopolitics is going to be led by the economics now. And I think it's kind of enormously symbolic, portentous that China is growing, even though it's not spectacular, it's growing, and the rest of the world mainly is still not, and isn't likely to be anytime soon. I think that's going to be really significant.
Michael, that's a great point that Kerry just raised. Now geopolitics is going to be led by geoeconomics. It is the economic that's talking, right? But the US is not growing. What's your view at the end of 2020 that's different from when you started the year at the beginning about the China-US relationship?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I would go back to the geopolitics. I think that the standoff between China and India in Ladakh, for me, was a signature moment for China. And we could discuss what exactly provoked that dispute, but I think that from the perspective of Washington, it's an indication that the increasingly assertive and, one could argue, aggressive activities of China have come on the radar, not only in the South China Sea, which has long been a concern for Washington, but now further west along the border with India. The fact that you had deadly violence for the first time in several decades, I think that really woke up a lot of people here in Washington to not just the idea of China being a strategic competitor, but also being a strategic threat in the sense that it imperils the interests of U.S. treaty allies for sure, but also key partners such as India. So I would highlight that. I think that it changed the thinking on some levels among many in Washington.
So in the political realm, I suppose it is still politics that's dominating the conversations there. But Kerry again just talked about the fundamental economic parallels are changing. Arno, I just referred to this simulated game that we did about China-US, and bear in mind that involved a great team of Trans-Pacific scholars from all over the world on China. What did we learn at the end of that simulated theory? What do you think 2020, what was that pivotal moment?
I think in terms of what we learned, we can see that no matter what administration we're going to see in Washington, U.S. policy towards China is not going to change drastically. And that is because there's so many interests of the U.S. governments that are basically in a collision course with the Chinese one. And in the simulation, and I think in terms of what we saw from what we can learn from it, we understood that right now in Washington, it's not very popular to be a friend of China. There's nothing to gain. And from that perspective, if you ask me what was the main event that shaped or will shape China's in the upcoming years, it's actually the fact that we're going to see a new administration coming, but we're not going to see a new drastic change in policy. And that's something that in November, when Trump lost the elections, even though there were maybe some wish for that kind of a change to happen among Chinese officials, I think in a way they're going to be a bit disappointed to see that no change is going to come, maybe in rhetorics, but not in actions.
So Sid, it's rather interesting here from the DC perspectives that are very, very different from, from the global multilateral organizations. But before I come back to you from a UN perspective, I'd love to come to Mario. We are so glad to have you as a home turf expert. You are Italian American who's currently in China. And you started to be very actively engaged in China's technological space as well. So we just heard quite a lot of views from outside of China, but within China, fundamentally, the economic structure is changing. China is welcoming in the 14th five-year plan. China just launched a 15-year long vision. So within China 2020, what are the biggest structural change that you see?
Thank you, Shirley. You mentioned I'm the one here in China. For 21 years, I've been here in China. It's a long time, and I'm very, very happy to be here. It surprises me to say that China became my home. China's my home, and I have a Chinese wife and a Chinese mother-in-law who doesn't speak a word of English, or Italian for that matter. So
mother-in-law is not very tough.
Yeah, no, it's a beautiful life. It really is. And all of us this evening have to make a very strong effort in order to avoid dovetailing back to the geopolitical influence, because it's so pervasive in 2020 and on so many levels. So I won't. I'll do what you asked. I'll stop and say, no, the human perspective, the real daily life human perspective. I just did another video. My last video for CGTN was entitled What Everybody Wants in Their Daily Life. And the answer, safe, to feel safe and to be stable, to feel safe and stable. That's what people actually want in their daily life. And if they don't have that, they're in big trouble. So when you talk about the one moment in 2020 that defined China, for me, it was something that I personally experienced with my family. We were locked down here. The extremity to which the Chinese government went to lock down the entire country and literally save the lives of 1.4 billion people. The extremity of the lockdown was unbelievable, and it sent a message to the world that, here we go, socialism comes before individualism. The society comes before the individual, which is a flip, an exact flip of the extremity of neoliberalism out of the West. But it happened, and it was real, that they made it very, very clear. Everybody needs to work together to protect the neighborhood. I couldn't go downstairs my elevator and go out the gate. It was,
of course,
so
yeah.
They protected the society. They really showed the world what they mean by protecting the society, which meant diametrically protecting every individual's freedom. So that was an incredible thing. And of course, it's not something the West liked that happened. Virus-free, 1.4 billion population country. It's an incredible thing.
So, which reminds me, the book that I'm currently reading, the Bertrand Russell's book on the history of Western philosophy, which also talks about this perpetual balance between social stability and the individual pursuit of individual liberty. It's a perpetual topic for all governments. So, Sid, it's rather interesting. We hear that geopolitics certainly dominated international relationships for the entire 2020, and with China as the highlight, of course. But from your perspective, you are the current resident coordinator for the United Nations in Kenya, from the developing world in Africa, where China has substantial strategic relationship with. China has launched its version of global connectivity under the Belt and Road Initiative, and I should say we're coming into year 8 now. How is it progressing in Africa? And now, supposedly, coming into 2021, the economy is continuing, it's going to be tough for a while. Countries won't have the money to pay for building infrastructure. Is China going to roll back some of the programs? What is going to happen with the Belt and Road Initiative, particularly in Africa, you think?
You know, to me, the Belt and Road Initiative is perhaps the singular signature program which is most important to the Africa context. And I say this coming from a developing country myself, and I've seen what the Belt and Road has done in Kenya and in the neighborhood of Kenya. I mean, let me just give you one anecdotal evidence. You know, there's a northern part of Kenya called Marsabit County, which borders Ethiopia. And there's a road which comes all the way from a port in Lamu called the Natsat Highway. Now, this is an area which had seen internecine violence over several years, and the UN actually facilitated a dialogue between these different belligerent clans and tribes which had been at war with each other. And in 2015, we got President Uhuru Kenyatta and Prime Minister Haile Mariam, then the former Prime Minister of Ethiopia, to come together and sign an MOU. And we use what is the UN Secretary General's clarion call, Antonio Guterres' clarion call on the triple nexus of peace, development, and humanitarian action. You know, Shirley, if you or your audience were to look at this road, what it has done to transform lives and livelihoods is pretty phenomenal. It has scaled down the conflicts. It has brought communities together. It's brought trade, commerce. I mean, it looks like an autobahn in the middle of nowhere. And suddenly you find prosperity emerging along that road. So I bear witness to what the possibilities of the Belt and Road Initiative are. So it has made significant inroads in Africa under the BRI. Now, in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, China has also announced about 50 of its BRI projects have been affected, and clearly so, because there have been limitations on the movement of labor and goods imposed by countries in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And that has affected the construction of physical infrastructure. And the global economic downturn and slowdown on the whole has also increased likelihood of many host countries delaying Belt and Road initiatives, especially the large-scale infrastructure projects. However, the ripple effects of COVID-19 are already currently affecting the pace and scope of the BR activity in Africa and elsewhere. The impact is likely to be, but in my view, very short term. Indications are that in the longer term, the scope of BRI will widen. For example, the African Union has signed a memorandum of understanding on BRI cooperation with China, and discussions have already started on the joint possibilities of BRI under the Africa Free Continental Trade Area. Now, this is very, very crucial. Africa, with a population of 2.3 billion by 2050, with about 850 million young people, is where the future of consumption and production is going to happen. In my view, this road which I spoke about was a partnership between China, the European Union, the government of Kenya, the Africa Development Bank, and I really believe we'll have to put geopolitics aside and allow economic governance to come together to look at the socio-economic transformation of Africa, because that is what will bring global prosperity and perhaps global peace too. Over to you.
Mm-hmm. Kerry, is China representing the emerging world now? Is China the de facto leader of the emerging world, you think?
I mean, it depends what you mean by emerging world. I mean, I think its self-interest is to sometimes have leadership positions. I mean, it has that in the past in environmental issues. And if opportunity leads it to that kind of position, I'm sure it's not averse to it. I mean, I don't think it wants, I mean, to me, I don't think it's a proselytizing power. I think it's a self-interested power, and that's part of the problem of China, but part of its strength. It means that it doesn't look for some kind of quasi-US role as a sort of policeman. It sort of wants to maybe keep arm's length and some of the complexity of the Middle East and African issues. I mean, it's got, you know, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence since the mid-1950s to kind of try and preserve that. I mean, I'm respectful of what people mean when they say It's not about the geopolitics. But in my experience, if you don't go to see the geopolitics comes to find you. And I think that this year has been the moment when a lot of people who never really thought much about China before realize it comes into our space. China influences our lives in the pandemic in ways which have been obviously complex and problematic, but in economic terms too. And I think it's going to need a proactive response before, politicians need to kind of articulate a narrative of how we, kind of get benefit and cooperation well. Otherwise, as in Australia, and I think in a little bit in the United States and maybe in the UK, you get some fairly negative things happening where the whole kind of dialogue is corroded by profound geopolitical division and a kind of, sort of almost like a Cold War mentality. And that is really disastrous.
You think that Cold War mentality is disastrous, and I think exactly where you're based in the UK. It was a couple months ago, the UK originated a concept of the D10 countries. And so you're right at the epicenter there. But I guess from my experience also, I find two very different set of virtually parallel conversations about the global perceptions of China. One comes from by and large, the OECD, the transatlantic world, and the other coming from the emerging world. I guess, Sid, you just talked about a very strong view about the G77 countries. So cooperation, but I guess how does the developed world see that developing, that South-South cooperation going forward? What do you think, Michael Arn from Washington, D.C.? Do you not see that as a reality coming? Are you doing something about it?
Well, I have to agree, first of all, with what Kerry just said. You cannot remove the geopolitics from any conversation about China in the U.S. And I use the BRI as an example there. If you look at what some of the intended end goals are for the Belt and Road Initiative, right? To build infrastructure, to generate more connectivity, to generate more employment, more prosperity, more stability. Those are goals that do not differ with what the U.S. would like to see as general outcomes, particularly in Asia and the developing world. But the fact that it is China that is America's top strategic competitor, the fact that it is China that's the one doing all that, that's what draws U.S. concern. And so I think that from a strictly economic lens, any government in Washington would have no reason to oppose the Belt and Road Initiative. And yet and of course, until fairly recently, the U.S. government had not registered formal opposition to the Belt and Road Initiative. That only came in 2019. But the fact that it's China that is the one that is doing all this, that is where the concern comes in from the U.S. government. And my own sense, and I think that in Washington there would be acknowledgement of this, that the world, and specifically the developing world, needs Chinese infrastructure. Infrastructure is a huge need for so many countries around the world. And no one can do it like China can in terms of delivering, putting out the capital so quickly, doing the building, getting something out there. The US can't hold a candle to that. And the Trump administration came out with this Indo-Pacific policy and associated institutions like the Development Finance Corporation and the Blue Dot Network, which were meant to position the United States to provide an alternative to China as one that can generate infrastructural support and all of that. But clearly, the U.S. cannot hold a candle to what China has done. And there are key regions, key countries like the Philippines, for example, key allies of the United States that look at the United States for security support. But generally speaking, over the years have continued to look to China as a source of economic support. Obviously these are considerations that the new administration will have to consider as it figures out how to align its China policy.
No one is stopping the U.S. from having a bigger engagement in the developing world, including the Asia Pacific and in Africa. So what's stopping it?
Well, I wouldn't say it's so much that they're being stopped as much as they're not being as motivated as they would like to, or others would like it to be. Obviously, I think in the U.S. there is a growing understanding that there is a need to look at Africa as an arena in which U.S. Focus and U.S. resources should be converted to and should be definitely go there. But the question is, for a lot of U.S. officials, is how do you do that while at the same time without causing kind of a pendulum effect, which would kind of deter countries to interact with the U.S. or deter U.S. politicians and the U.S. public from getting involved in Africa, just because there are actions that need to be taken when we look at Africa, each country is its own case, but in many cases, what is required are to do things that not necessarily will gain public support in the US, especially in a year in which you have such an economic cost to those kind of things and such an economic situation in the US that definitely that's not something that the US politicians right now will see an urgency to do. And I think that's something that this is something that is causing the lack of motivation, I would say, from U.S. officials to get more involved.
And Mario, supposedly, Sid just beautifully talked about, how infrastructure changes lives. And I would even go following Michael's advice, lots of developing worlds need more infrastructure, particularly for post reconstruction of, post COVID-19. And I would even argue to say that right within the United States here, we need more infrastructure as well. But infrastructure costs money. So from the Chinese political and strategic calculus, now it's a difficult financial period, and who's going to pay for all these infrastructures? Is China still willing to continue to finance a large part of these, exceptional global infrastructure initiatives?
Shirley, may I just make one quick point?
Yeah, please, of course.
So, Africa's infrastructure gap remains massive, with opportunities for development projects such as intra-regional transport network, power generation solutions, revolutionizing manufacturing and agro-processing, and achieving environmentally responsible natural resources extraction. The Africa Development Bank, for example, estimates that Africa's infrastructure needs are between 130 billion and 180 billion per year, but financing currently remains short by about $108 billion per year. What I'm trying to say is that here is where there is an opportunity for a resurrection of the spirit of multilateralism, which must be much more guided by large-scale public-private partnerships. I've seen that happen here. I have seen that happen between Europe and China. I've seen that happen between Kenya and the US. I was recently in the Silicon Valley. We merged together to create a Silicon Savannah here. The opportunities are endless. And keep in mind, the gentlemen, which part of the world they are all coming from, are coming from what is known as the demographic echo. The population is aging there. Here in this continent, the median age of the population is between 18 to 20. The growth potential is massive. I mean, if you're talking about a demographic dividend, here is where it's going to happen. It's like the Marshall Plan in post-Second World War Europe. Now, if we are smart about this, we would still deal with our geopolitics across in the UN and the convention centers, but look at our private sector to come together and make real change, because this is what will also impact the bottom line of the pension funds and everything else that are in the other parts of the world. So it's a win-win for all sides. And that is why I'm re-emphasizing the resurrection of multilateralism is so critical now more than ever with an economic viewpoint. Back to you.
It's a great point. Mario, your views? Mario, you are mute. So, Sid, on your multilateralism, why don't we just continue from there? interestingly, just a couple of hours ago, we were closely. Mario, sorry, you are mute. Please go ahead.
No problem. Go right ahead.
Yes,
Do you want me to continue? I'm sorry about that. As you mentioned, this is a pivotal point about these large infrastructure programs. And I'm going to look at it and share it from the point of view, not necessarily to be talking, as Sid was, about the resurgence of global multilateralism and all of those other points, which are, of course, very, very valid. But from the point of view of the Chinese government exporting what they tested and proved to be a successful model of infrastructure development. China developed cookie cutter cluster regions, the megacity regions, and they did that primarily with the highway system, but more importantly, they did it with the Gautier, with the train system. And now they proved the model first. And they did it with Shenzhen, they did it with Pudong, they did it with Shanghai. Now they're doing it. They did it all over the country afterwards, and they proved it. So what is it? It's to say, Shirley and everyone, if I live I'm just going to say, if I live in Phoenix, Arizona, and it's 5 hours to LA and 5 hours to Las Vegas, then that's 5 hours between those three cities. And I'm a businessman and I want to do business, and I'm in Phoenix, and I say I want to expand my business. Well, it's 5 hours to LA. I'm not going to do it. It's 5 hours to Las Vegas. I'm not going to expand my business. It's too far. And if that 5 hours becomes 1 hour and 20 minutes for $8, that it only costs me $8 to get from Phoenix to Las Vegas, and from Las Vegas to LA, and from LA back to Phoenix. And each trip is only 1 hour and 20 minutes, and each trip is only $8. That is going to stimulate, and that's going to pay for the cost of that infrastructure. The economy is going to be stimulated tremendously. My life as an entrepreneur and as a businessman, I'm going to all of a sudden be able to expand to those other cities. That's a economic and infrastructure miracle. I'll stop there.
Infrastructure expedites economic growth. That's I think in the economic world, at least, that seems to be the consensus there. So on the one pivotal change that Aaron has obviously started to allude to a little bit, is the incoming U.S. administration. Of course, that's going to fundamentally reshape China-U.S. Evolving relationships, but also China's position in the world. For the Biden administration, we just heard that a lot of the Trump era policies, including the tariffs, trade, the deals, etc., aren't going to be immediately reversed. What's going to change? What's not going to change in 2021? Michael.
So, I mean, one caveat that I always throw out there when I'm asked this question about what to expect from the Biden administration, not to state the obvious, but yes, China will be a key priority for this administration. However, the domestic stuff will be the very initial goal. I mean, it's quite clear that when the Biden administration is sworn in a few weeks, the immediate goal will be dealing with the pandemic. I mean, that will be the priority, and with the associated goal of economic recovery. Those will take precedence over everything else. I think that's quite clear. But certainly, China will be a key goal, and I think here, I know that there's a tendency from some observers to associate this incoming administration with the Obama administration and its views on China, which many perceive to be inappropriately dovish, so to speak, at a moment when there's pretty strong bipartisan consensus in Washington that China is very much a strategic competitor. I think that's a wrong perception to have. I think that Biden, who of course was Obama's vice president, and his administration will take a very different position to China than the Obama administration did, just because things have changed so much. And the perception in Washington is that China's own policies have changed so much over the last 4 years, particularly as evidenced by this so-called wolf warrior diplomacy idea, which here in Washington is viewed as something that is very problematic for U.S. interests. So it's too early to tell where this administration will go when it comes to China on issues like tariffs or anything else. I think that this is a time when this incoming administration is trying to figure out what it's going to do. On a very basic level, I do think that there will be a strong effort to try to ease many of the tensions that have emanated from the very harsh, and many of us would argue, inappropriate rhetoric that came from the Trump administration, just like using terms like Wuhan or Chinese virus, things like that. You're not going to hear any of that with this administration. So I do think that there'll be an opportunity for there's better diplomacy on very superficial levels, just because this incoming administration will be much more diplomatic in terms of how it messages its views toward China. I think that climate change will certainly be a huge issue, broadly speaking, for the administration and for U.S. foreign policy. And I think it's quite clear that this is one area that the administration will want to try to leverage as something that can bring about cooperation between the two countries. I think it's quite clear that John Kerry, who will become this new climate czar, he has very strong views about how it's critical to work more closely with China to deal with the climate change issue. I think that the challenge, though, for this administration is to figure out how to ensure that Beijing does not try to use climate change cooperation as a bargaining chip for other types of issues, e.g. concern that Beijing would try to hold off on doing the climate change mitigation measures that the U.S. would be looking for it to do until the U.S. is willing to make other concessions in the strategic framework. So I think that's something to consider. But I'll end with this. The Biden administration certainly will continue to view China and its activities in the South China Sea and the broader Asia region as concerning. But I think the main difference you'll see with this administration and the outgoing one is that there will be more of an effort on the part of the Biden administration to work with partners, particularly in Europe, to try to figure out ways to push back on China. Human rights issues, human rights issues will be a big thing for this administration. So, the issue of the Uyghurs will be something that this administration will not hold back on in highlighting. But I think that one of the main differences you'll see is that this administration will try to work more with partners and with the world more broadly in a coordinated fashion to try to figure out how to counterbalance China.
Very interesting. Now, the Biden administration certainly has talked about working in closer alliance across the Atlantic, but just right now we are waiting for this final signing moment that looks with a high probability is going to come before the end of the year for this China-EU bilateral investment treaty. We heard in the news that the Biden administration perhaps were engaged with the EU counterparts to say, well, wait for us, right? Before you make this final decision. Kerry, I guess, and for Aaron too, and the rest of the gents, when it comes to economic interests, EU is moving ahead with China, right? Is EU waiting for the United States, waiting for Biden administration?
Well, look, I mean, this agreement has been a long time coming, right? I mean, this is not out of a clear blue sky. I think they've been discussing it over a decade. And there's been lots of ideological fights about, whether the European Union recognizes China's market economy status. So, I mean, as often, it's not, it's an issue of timing. The European Union has chosen like not an easy time to do this. The optics don't look great. I mean, the content of the agreement, as far as I've seen, is sensible. I mean, the finance services is not different to the US agreement, with China early this year. It's always wanted reciprocity. I mean, in the Commission statement in 2019, 2019, there was a very strong statement from the European Union that they wanted reciprocity. There's been this era in which they felt that there'd been unequal deals. So that's not different to really what the Trump administration was often about. The idea of the unequal deals. So I think the philosophical underpinnings of the agreement aren't a problem. The issue really is that within Europe, as in the United States, elsewhere, labor standards and values, the sort of conviction is that trade needs to be underpinned by certain values. That's what the European Union believes. And I mean, I presume that's what the United States believes. And I guess China is really contesting that and saying, no, we have different values, but we can still do the trade stuff. And what the European Union has tried to do is to politicize its market, rather like China, by saying, you want to deal with this massive, important market, you've got to kind of sign up to our labor deals and like that. The weapon that China probably has against that is lack of transparency. So while Europe can say, we have done a deal with China where we know that we're not getting companies dealing with Xinjiang and things like this, in fact, they don't really know, and they'll be vulnerable to that. So I imagine if the deal is done, that's really where the battle's going to be. And there will be a big, big misalignment between the United States and Europe about how they're defending this key area of values underlying trade and who has sold out. I think that's already starting to appear in the criticisms of this deal.
And I think one interesting moment for me personally in 2020 is the fact that with China's positive growth, although meager at 2%, China is going to surpass the economic mass of the entire EU 27 economies by the end of 2020. And so China is going to come on somewhere around $15.7 trillion of GDP in 2020. And I think the EU, now we don't have the UK anymore, is going to come in about 15.4 trillion. So we're talking about two ginormous but equal weighting markets potentially coming together. I mean, Aaron and Mario, this is interesting. Michael talked about the transatlantic solidarity. Now, our EU partners there are saying, hey, US, you got the phase one trade deal, so why are you holding us back? I suppose Biden administration and his team are going to make a phone call to some EU partners, and what's going to happen in that phone conversation?
I think we're going to see that on different aspects, we're going to see a different US policy. So when it comes to technology, we're going to see a continuation of the same line. We're not going to see kind of a setback, because there's definitely not only a clash, but there's a mega trend going on, kind of a conceptual understanding today that's emerging, that when it comes to prime technologies, people are treating it, or countries are treating it as commodities, as valuable commodities. So on those kind of things, we're going to see that the US and the EU are going to clash, because on the one hand, you're going to have the request or the need of some countries to have more of Chinese technology, because they want to open the market, and also because they can receive in response from the Chinese interest to the Chinese market. While the US is leading a very tough line, a very hawkish line when it comes to the applications of Chinese technologies, from 5G, AI, and even stuff that are related to semiconductors and stuff like that. There's a very, very tough stance from the US in terms of how to look at the Chinese. So on that regard, we're going to see a clash between the EU and the US, and we're going to see an attempt by the US go country by country to build some sort of a technological alliance in order to stop and in order to make sure that technology is not going to leak back to China, and Chinese technology is not going to be used in Europe. And that's going to be a policy that started with Trump very aggressively, and I don't think that's going to change because of that kind of a mega trend that we see today, which is that trend of technology being a commodity and so on. The second thing is when it comes to economic relations and trade, we have to remember that we're just starting to see kind of an economic recovery. We're going to start to see an economic recovery at best at the second half of 2021, at best. And that's together with the vaccinations operations that's going to take over in the world. So if we're going to see those economic recoveries taking over, a lot of governments are going to do everything they can to make sure that nothing is stopping that recovery, because there is going to be a lot of political pressure by people who lost their job. And those are usually those who were in industries that do not benefit from globalization. So China for them is a competitor. Literally, when they hear China, they hear a competition to their work. So we're going to see a lot of pressure on that. So what at the end of the day, what I think we're going to see is we're going to see a Trump administration policy applied by a Biden administration. We're not going to see so much of a massive change as people are hoping for. We're going to see more of the same. The package is going to be different. The packaging is going to be more settled, more nicer. But fundamentally, there's not going to be a massive change when it comes from the US. And there's going to be subtle clashes, but still clashes between the EU and the US on that.
So you are basically seeing a continuation of the Trump era policy. Sorry.
Shirley, I just wanted to say this. It's my hope and aspiration, purely from a development and a multilateral context, that we need to rev up and put our foot on the accelerator towards the sustainable development goals, which is essentially the North Star that is guiding the entire planet. It is about planet, people, and prosperity. And I think there is mutual prosperity which will underpin this new renaissance, because quite clearly what we've seen with the COVID crisis is an economic crisis which rivals the Great Depression. Nobody would have thought in the West there was ever a possibility that there'd be food lines that would go miles after miles after miles. The inconceivable in the West has ended up happening. And I think perhaps the time now, and this is wishful thinking, and I hope as a multilateralist, as the vision of the UN Secretary General is, they have said that this is not just a health emergency, it's an economic and a development emergency. We need to leapfrog the Sustainable Development Goal, where we need to harness big data, technology, and innovations. And where I see real partnerships, Trans-Pacific partnerships happening is in 5 areas. First is in the space of artificial intelligence. That's going to be absolutely mission critical. For example, we are discussing AI here in Kenya on 3D printed technology to put affordable housing in place. As a matter of fact, as we are speaking, there's a 3D printed house on its way from China to Kenya, which I negotiated, and we're trying to see if we can actually go to scale with 2 million houses. The second is semiconductors. Can there be collaboration there? The third is in the space of quantum computing. Again, a very, very important area if we are talking about leapfrogging development. And 2 more, which is biotechnology and financial technology. I think if around this, the world and the private sector could come together, Africa is the place where we could transform markets. And this would actually lead to mutual prosperity across the planet, because ultimately that is the bottom line of what, Agenda 2030 is trying to achieve. Back to you.
Mario, talking about from AI to quantum computing to biotech to fintech, China is obviously either leading or eyeing to lead in the current decade globally in these technologies. So it's no doubt the technology is going to transform the global development to another level. So what is your view about Sid's proposal there within these critical areas of future development to have a Trans-Pacific Partnership? Do you see any likelihood that China and the US can potentially work together in these areas?
My view is to say that the United States does not want to acknowledge or let the rest of the world acknowledge how far ahead of the game China is. I mean, the fact that China has an economy and a society with no virus right now puts it months, if not 18 months, or 2 years ahead of all the of Europe and ahead of the United States in terms of recovery, in terms of growth, in terms of strength, in terms of the capability to move forward. And I want to say it in a colloquial way. Skipping the politics, we can easily see which side the bread is buttered on. The side of the bread is buttered on the China side. China is doing extremely well, very, very strong. Now, I say it as a joke when I say Sid put the cart before the horse. What I mean to say is all of those 5 wonderful advanced technology points you just mentioned, and Shirley, you just mentioned, are absolutely, it's true. But let's get the trains built first. Let's get the infrastructure done first. Now, that's to say, I went to the Huawei Connect event in Shanghai. I was one of the few foreigners, as you mentioned, Shirley, because I was in China. So I could attend Huawei Connect this year in Shanghai at the Pudong Exhibition Center. And I saw AI applied to infrastructure projects, and it blew my mind because I'm not a tech guy, you know that. I was watching AI and automation and in 5G all being utilized in the mining industry, and I was like, in the mining industry, you know, in the ground, in the dirt, you know, something fundamental. And the application that made, and then it was shown and explained to me how the application of AI and 5G, etc., made increase the efficiencies of processes and operations and procedures by hundreds of %. And that's all China. So this is why the CAI was just signed. Forget the political bluster. The European Union now needs a Marshall Plan to recover, and China can provide that, quote, Marshall Plan. The U.S. is not in a position to. So I'm going to push back a little bit on Oren, who's saying that the United States won't give in to China. I think that in the end they have to, because they see China pulling ahead. And so if you keep seeing your competitor pulling ahead so far, you're either going to bomb them to stop them, or you're going to go, okay, well, wait a minute. We better start being nice to them and talking to them because they're pulling way ahead of us. They're doing so well. We can't ignore it. We can't be mean to them anymore. This has got to stop. We better start cooperating and collaborating with them. You can't contain the uncontainable. So in that sense, I think that the U.S. policy will pivot more favorably toward China. It's going to take a while, but it's not going to remain as hardline as I think some of the other folks here are suggesting. And of course, I'm just guessing it, though. I'm just guessing when I say this. We'll see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Of course, the U.S. is still a quarter of the global GDP. It's the most significant economic power, no doubt. China is about this year about coming up to 80% of that of the U.S. But nonetheless, put aside the U.S., there is still 75% of the global economy, and arguably most of the emerging world within it are going to be faster growing. And so China is fundamentally using its technology to transform those economies and the societies. But I want to come back to you, Kerry. You mentioned about Australia. And so let's leave the U.S. for a minute and talk about the rest of the 75% of the world. Australia-China relationship at one point in time was so warm and fuzzy, and now it's ice cold. What's going to happen there? It can't stay ice cold forever. It's hard for me to see that.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I talk about Australia and China is because I was based at the University of Sydney for 3.5 years from 2012. And indeed, I think I met you a couple of times in Sydney, Shirley. So we both know the environment there. And I've sort of really watched the kind of transformation of the relationship over the last couple of years with bewilderment. I mean, Australia is, kind of got a very unique relationship with China because it's by far the biggest trading partner now, has been for the last 10 years. And I think China is, the biggest investor, or maybe not in stocks, but certainly year on year until maybe a year ago. But the political relationship has really become difficult. And if you want to have a unpleasant afternoon, not that you have, there's a lot of competition to kind of create that these days, but just sort of get involved in Australia debates on Twitter, and you'll get some delightful, charming creatures come and, they show that it's incredibly divisive. When I was there, I don't remember it being so divisive. What's going to happen? The brute reality is that Australia had nearly 3 decades of continuous growth because of China. I mean, it got through the 2008 crisis while the rest of the world suffered because of its strong links with China. And I don't know, in 2021, there's going to be, everyone's paying a price for the pandemic. And it's going to be a pretty brutal choice between Australia maintaining this frosty, combative relationship with China, or it being pragmatic. Now, Scott Morrison, who has been pretty kind of hard-edged towards China in terms of investment. When he was treasurer, now as prime minister, has maintained that. He has been more conciliatory recently. In the last few weeks, before that, very, very frosty. I think this is going to be an absolute proof that economics will decide the geopolitics. Because if Australia is going to be really languishing, it's going to be hard for a politician to say, we're going to kind of maintain this wonderful plateau and not deal with these terrible, terrible people across the waters. When they're going to be potentially the biggest source of growth, not America or Europe. So this is really the canary in the cage to watch. Australia is the one to watch.
Of course, economies determine geopolitics. And Mario, your views.
Kerry just summarized it so beautifully. The economics are going to dictate the politics. It's not going to. The politics dictated the economics for 2020. For lots of interesting reasons, let's just say that, right? But that can't sustain. Like I said, the world, if you stop and look at the economics, you can clearly see which side the bread is buttered on, and that's it. The economics are going to dictate the politics. The Biden administration is I don't want to say flip, never, but they're going to have to soften up and start playing nice with China, because China is pulling ahead, and they're going to pass the U.S. in GDP. It's going to have, in fact, hasn't everybody here noticed that all of these problems have somehow, the 2008-2009 crisis, which the United States caused, served to catapult China upward. The pandemic served to catapult China upward. Isn't it interesting that all of these problems, and the more that Trump attacks China, the better China ends up looking in the end. The economics trumping the politics, absolutely. Yeah.
And I appreciate the views, but at the same time, I should say, though, I think both the Chinese people as well as the Chinese economy had suffered in 2020, and that's indeed the case. But Kerry, coming back, you are in London. The UK-China relationship has gone through this downward spiral as well in 2020. We started the year with, allowing Huawei access in the UK's 5G networks, and then we banned Huawei, and then so on and so forth. And then now it's, do you think China is going to sort of put the same or similar level of pressure to the UK government in a way what China puts on Australian government?
Look, it's not as extreme because the UK's exposure to China is different, as you know. It's not our biggest trading partner. That is the EU. And in the last few minutes, our great and noble parliament has just passed this deal, this sort of free trade deal with the EU, which I don't know, during the, I don't want to end on a sour note, but of course, 3.5 years ago, during the referendum, no one said we would be poorer, as a result of leaving the EU. But I don't know. It's not really as good a deal as we would have if we stayed in the EU. That's just a fact. We may be richer in sovereignty, but it's going to be more difficult. Now, is China going to fill some of those gaps? Well, we've just offered 3.5 million Hong Kongese the right to move here if they want, under a sort of, kind of deal, which is a little difficult to quantify. But, those are the sorts of things where it's not going to be easy to have a kind of different relationship with China when you're also, kind of dealing with very antagonizing and difficult positions. I'm not saying the UK is wrong in what it's doing. You can't really think that China's going to be the big friend when you've obviously got lots of issues with it. It will be a different relationship. It may be that we'll take risks. We have in our dear leader in Britain now, the, inimitable Boris Johnson, a gambler. Now that Mr. Trump is leaving the stage, Mr. Johnson will be there to entertain us. I have to say, being in London, that it's not relaxing. And while you are entertained, it has always been my belief that British politics should be boring. And alas, we are entering interesting times, which is a problem.
Which is a problem. It's an entertaining problem, I guess, for a lot of geopolitics, I should say. So now you're saying, Kerry, that UK is probably in sort of a stronger position than Australia because it's less dependent on the Chinese economy. But Michael, coming back to your earlier point, you raised the three amazing points. I want to come back to the other two. One is on climate change, and China has called for carbon neutral by 2060. And Sid over, just a little bit earlier has called for, we need to expedite to achieve this UN SDG. How can China and the US cooperate on climate change?
Well, obviously, the first step is for them to be talking about the issue, and there needs to be enough trust to allow those delicate, difficult conversations to take place. And again, this is something that will be a signature issue. I mean, you're looking to talk about predictions in 2021. Climate change is going to be a key priority for this incoming administration. I mean, you've got a president who put a very distinguished, respected individual with wide support on bipartisan levels, John Kerry, gave him this new role of climate czar, posted him on the National Security Council, which I think is an indication not just of how much importance Biden places in the issue of climate change, but how he sees the links between climate change and national security, which is certainly very true. I think that's worthwhile. But as I understand it, if you look at some of the commentary that's come out in recent weeks, there appears to be somewhat of a disconnect between how John Kerry wants to approach the issue of climate change with China and how Biden himself and others within this incoming administration would want to tackle it. John Kerry appears to want to think that climate change should define the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and China, and essentially you have to work with China to get to some sort of agreement on climate change mitigation, and that everything else in the relationship has to play second fiddle. Whereas others that are going to be in this administration, including Biden, believe that that's a very wrong-headed thing to do, that you need to figure out a way to close off the climate change issue from the strategic issue so that China does not try to, as I said before, use climate change as a bargaining chip. So answer to your question, it's very simple. I don't know exactly how the best way forward is on this issue, but you need the two sides to be talking. There need to be difficult but sustained conversations. And given the state of the bilateral relationship over the last 2 years, that's easier said than done. But that's why I think that you will get a lot of positive sounds from this administration in its early days. I imagine that the administration will reach out to the Chinese leadership fairly early on in its term, just to try to set a tone, to indicate that this is an administration that is willing to work with China, will certainly disagree with it on many things, but is not going to let the relationship be hijacked by ugly rhetoric and polemicism and the unfortunate things that happened with the last few years of the Trump administration.
Of course. And so, Michael, your view is that this climate change agreement is primarily going to happen on a bilateral level between China and the United States. But Sid, you certainly want a global climate change initiative within the UN framework. How important is the UN going forward in the climate change negotiations?
Shirley, it's like the COVID. It's an existentialist issue, and we have to address it from a multilateral perspective. So I'm really glad, that John Kerry has been appointed as the climate czar to John Biden, to Mr. Biden. But most importantly, is that they have already said that they want to come back into the Paris Agreement. I believe that China and the US need to be at the vanguard of really on the dialogue of the global climate agreement. And that's the only way it's going to happen. So as I said, there are many points of convergence. There's actually fewer points of differences. And I hope the climate issue, the health issue, the issue of economic becomes an aspect of really renewing global multilateralism. Shirley, I'll have to sign off from here because I have a next call to jump into, but it's really been an honor making the acquaintance of your great audience and as well as your panelists. Thank you very much.
Of course, Sid, we so much appreciate your views and insights. And just before you leave, if I may, on behalf of our audience, to ask for a quick highlight for 2021 that you believe will fundamentally change China's global impact, what would it be? What would you suggest China do in 2021?
I really believe it's really a focus on Africa. and really countries coming together, the renewal of multilateralism in Africa, really looking at the economic growth and pushing the continent into the next generation of upward mobility. And I see real partnerships being forged. I can see it's an aspiration, but I see that as a real possibility as well.
Thank you so much, Sid. And if I may ask the rest of the gentlemen, what would you like to see happen in China in 2021, please? As your concluding remark.
I think, obviously, I would like to see pragmatism. I mean, I think we've had a quite ideological year, and it would be good if there was sort of like a realism in our relationship. I mean, there are big differences, but I think for Europe, for the UK, for America, and for Australia, a kind of recognition really that China is as it is. It's not going to go away. It shouldn't go away. And we need to have a more robust framework just to try and, kind of deal with each other practically without getting into these sort of fairly emotional, kind of ideological fights that, I don't know, don't really help with the big problem.
Doesn't help the big problem. So, Michael, you work for the Wilson Center. It's about Wilsonianism. Are we calling back the age of realism now in 2021?
Well, I would highlight a word that we've already highlighted today, and that is multilateralism. I think that it's clear that some of the biggest threats this world faces know no borders, right? Pandemics, climate change, others as well. And I think that it's important for both the US and China governments in this coming year to be willing to work together, not just bilaterally on the world stage, but also multilaterally. If you're going to have global responses to global challenges, you need the world's two biggest powers to be leading that charge. And we simply did not have that. We didn't have the two countries working together multilaterally recently. And I'm cautiously optimistic that we will see more of that this coming year.
Fantastic. What about Aaron, Mario, please?
Well, I hope in 2021 we're going to see China marking the way and leading the way of global openness when it comes to traveling, business. Definitely, I think it will be a good sign if that's going to happen, because it will show that the global economy is back to order. But second, I would definitely be interested to see how would China respond to the technological pressure that's going to be forced upon her by the US. And is the response going to be closing in, or the response going to be an invitation to US companies and others to come in and to open the Chinese market more to them, and in such a way to create a relationship in which they're basically saying, we're opening what you're closing, you only have what to lose. If that's going to happen, I think that would be a great achievement for everybody, because everybody will benefit from open economic relations.
And Mario.
I'll close it with this fascinating story. My dear friend up here in Shenyang invited me for a lunch. I ended up at lunch with a dozen very successful and rich millionaire and multimillionaire men at a typical Dongbei, Northeast China lunch with my friend. And they're all very, very sincere and down-to-earth people. We had open, friendly conversations. And I had the opportunity to survey. So I asked them all, Trump or not? And they all said, Trump. We want Trump. And I was shocked. And I said, now explain to me why. And they said, because even though he's made all this trouble, putting that kind of pressure on China has forced China to respond, to get better and better and better. And China has gotten better and better because of all of this pressure from Trump. So in the end, it's been good for China. It's kept the government accountable. And yes, China has to become a better and better global partner. It has to keep moving in that direction.
So we call for renewal of global multilateralism, economic recovery, business resumption, and the global technological partnership. Mario called for China's self-reliance, and we are starting to see some dominant trends that we hope to see from China. and the broader world indeed for 2021. Thank you so much for participating in today's dialogue on China's top predictions for 2021. Have a very happy new year.
Happy New Year, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.